Thank you for attending the talk, and I hope it goes without saying that I hope you'll find it insightful. So I'm Rickesh Advani. I'm 30 years old and I study HSPS at St. Edmunds. And before I tell you much more about my background, we're going to conduct a brief and interactive poll, just with a few answers to follow at the end. So Nish is going to bring up the first slide now, and if you can put your answers in the chat function. So number one, how many people are likely to suffer from any form of mental health illness? We have options from 15%, 25%, 45%, 55%, and 75%. So let's just see what's happening in the chat now. We got, a range of answers coming through. A very broad range of answers. Okay. And then for question 2, what proportion of mental illness began before 24 years old? Again, we've got a range of answers available: 25%, 45%, 60, 75, and 90. And again, if you can put your answers in the chat. Let's see what we have. A lot of C's, a lot of C coming, some B's. Okay. Okay, because quite a close grouping of answers there between B and C. And then finally, for question 3, of these 3 people, who would you think would be more, or who do you think is suffering from some form of mental health illness at this point in their life? We have boy A, a 22-year-old male at a top university who's secured a well-paid job. He's actively competitive in sports and enjoys going out and socializing. We have woman B, 34 years old. She's married to a successful doctor. She has her own thriving business and has 2 cars, 2 homes, and holidays frequently. And finally, lady C, a 65-year-old lady, retired teacher, has her own country home and 2 children, 2 grandchildren, 3 horses, and is in good physical health. So again, if we can see some answers coming through in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing so many answers for this one, but there we go. We're seeing a lot of B's coming out, A's. Well, to reveal, it may actually surprise you that it's 25% for answer A of people who suffer, but not 25% entirely, 25% of people in society per year. So as a humanities student, I'm no mathematician, but 25% of people per year is obviously far greater than 25 and is a substantially large number, or potentially substantially large number. For answer 2, again, it might surprise you, but it's actually 75% of people who begin suffering before the age of 24, which for me just highlights how important this time of transitioning from families through to education, through to early careers and employment is really so important and vital. And actually on the answer 3, believe it or not, it's all 3. Boy A is struggling with stress and anxiety. Lady B is discontent with paternity pressure. And lady C is suffering with isolation and loneliness. And through this workshop, what we hope to highlight is actually how sometimes we can all have moments of mental health difficulties, and particularly more so whilst we're adapting to these remote societies and working adaptively through this COVID pandemic. And therefore today we hope we can be thinking a little bit more about how we can have awareness of its presence and how we can work to overcome such struggles. And whether it's 25% or 75%, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree it's still far too high, especially when we stop to consider the often hidden elements of poor mental health. susceptibility to suffering is something that can happen at any given time and due to any number of unique circumstances. And these circumstances will differ for each person and will change for them relative to their environment. And I think this is what is really key here, how our environments have changed to something that is now something quite static and quite limbic. And therefore today we hope to offer some tools that will help to modify and cultivate these environments, not just mentally, but also literally. So personally, to tell you a bit about my background, I have disabilities, including autism and ADHD, but these were the two that really impacted me most. These defined my experiences. As from a young age, I struggled with social engagement, and although I always found it easy to meet people and make friends, I sometimes struggled to keep them. I struggled to feel understood, accepted, or adequate, and society seemed structured with these expectations that were overwhelming to a degree. So although I didn't quite identify my differences, I couldn't quite ignore them. After an attempt in my life, due to feelings of aimlessness, I spent 6 months in residential psychiatric ward in Guy's Hospital at the age of 14. And I returned to school only to be expelled. Having just been diagnosed, both me and the school lacked any understanding of these labels, which left me vulnerable to hanging out with the wrong crowd. And then after education, I just went from job to job, jumping from sort of one burnt bridge to the next. Being young, resilient, and in a buoyant job market, I didn't really stop to understand my difficulties. So I avoided sort of facing them within a flitty career. So it really took me to get to rock bottom, homelessness, destitution, a gambling addict, and on the street, to finally relinquish the pressures and distractions of life and have that catharsis to really introspect. And that allowed me to really identify the patterns of behavior that led to my downfall, learn the tools that would help me manage sort of the impact to mitigate and overcome these, and to change not only my approach, but also my outlook. So before just entering further education, I've spent the last 4.5 years running a not-for-profit called Never Leaving People, which over its time proved very successful actually in helping to overcome self-imposed barriers, mental health difficulties, and sort of personal challenges through championing NLP, neuro-linguistical programming, NLP also, Never Leaving People, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, to help understand our psychological processing and sort of build those self-confidences and create support networks to overcome them. And what we found most often was it was actually the small conscious adjustments that could make the most significant impact. So really it will be from some of those experiences that I'll draw from today as the tools for overcoming mental health, as far as I've experienced, are quite universal. And theoretically, tools don't change whether you're a top CEO, a Cambridge student, or an ex-homeless panel guest. But on that, I'm now going to pass over to Chris to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Rickesh. I hope you can all hear me. As Nishanta said, my name is Chris. I graduated from King's College last year in 2019. I studied music there, and I also sang in King's College Choir. And both experiences, the choir and my academic course, were great experiences. I'd love to do them again if I could. I'm not sure if I'll get the opportunity now that I've graduated, but I would love to do them again. And at the moment, I'm freelancing in Leeds. Before the pandemic, I was a performer. I was performing in Leeds and London as a soloist, a singer-soloist, and in a choir. And I also do some teaching, which has continued during the pandemic. I normally teach piano, music theory, and singing. and I've been doing some laborious administrative tasks in the process as well. Now, my first piece of advice to everyone who's studying at university is always try and enjoy your time at university. It is difficult, trust me, especially at Cambridge. They don't make it easy for you. But after university, you'll have bills to pay, you'll have a house to find, and you'll also have jobs to search for. And it's a very, very competitive world out there. So believe you me, Cambridge and just going to university in general is a good head start to all of that. Now, how do I link to mental health? Well, during my life, one obstacle has been a learning difficulty. And you may think, oh, someone at Cambridge, how can he suffer from a learning difficulty? Well, it creates a lot of negative influences. It can create some positive influences as well. So when I was at school, it was quite hard getting the support I needed, especially in primary school. Some teachers didn't always have the time. Teaching is a stressful job, but some teachers just simply didn't have the time. Other teachers just didn't really understand. And you could easily get labeled by your peers or friends as someone a little bit different, someone with whom they couldn't really socialize. And as a result, these were, of course, negative influences. And it's quite unhealthy, I feel, to suffer from those from quite a young age. And this is regardless of whether you have a learning difficulty, which is quite serious and noticeable, or whether, in my case, you have a learning difficulty which can be sometimes invisible. That is to say, it takes time to actually realize that someone has a learning difficulty. But I would say those were the negatives. But that being said, there were many positives which I was able to draw from. So, for example, I could stand up to other people. If I thought that someone was saying something which was quite insulting or which was a bit not really acceptable, I would say. The other thing is, I would also develop drive. I really wanted to prove to pupils, to other pupils in school, that I could really do well, that I could go to a good university. And these two skills, being able to stand up to people and being able to have drive, they're very, very important for the job market, I believe. And that's something which also people could develop during their university education. But even if they don't develop skills like that during university, you've got your whole life ahead of you as well, your whole life to develop things, to have experiences as well. So I believe that that's all quite important. Now, I'm going to move on to our first topic, which is learning disabilities, but now in relation to the current pandemic. Now, let's fast back to March 2020. I was obviously startled when the university, when Cambridge University had announced that all students had to leave with immediate effect. Cambridge wasn't the only university suffering from this. I think there were other institutions, other schools, which also had to do the same things. Coronavirus was a really unexpected thing in our lives. I think we can all agree on that. And everyone thought that life would continue as normal, that we'd all have a nice summer, that everyone would be at university now celebrating with May balls and things like that, which we now know are not happening, sadly. But in particular, I was thinking about those students, who were already struggling with their course and who were already in need of help, not to mention those with learning difficulties who would now have to distance themselves from the university. In-person appointments would not be available anymore. You could not go to the DRC, for example, which is the university's Disability Resource Centre, so the department which helps those with mental or physical disabilities and learning difficulties. As far as I'm aware, obviously I graduated last year, so the system was quite different, but obviously each university department had different decisions to make based on their assessments and their exams. Obviously, you know that exams can work in different ways. Some have to be face-to-face, some are viva voces, and some are written exams. And obviously now exams would have to be online. and I guess you'd have to think about typing or maybe just writing and scanning things in. But it is a difficult time, I believe, and I think there's a bit of advice which I'd like to give people, is to always keep in contact with your DOS, your director of studies, and your tutor. Let them know how things are going. The other thing is, if you feel like you need help, say so. There is nothing worse than feeling like you need help and not being able to speak to someone about it, whether it's on the phone, whether it's via email as well. I feel that everyone as well, peers, teachers and academics, should be able to help each other during this crisis, and especially those who are suffering, whose course might be in jeopardy because of this pandemic. And remember that everyone has a right to feel that they're either satisfied or not satisfied. Really, it's not really the question as to I've asked them enough. I feel that if I ask them again, they'll get annoyed with me. You should always say when you need help. Rickesh, do you have anything to add to those points?
I mean, to be honest, there's not much I can say. I know this is an area that Chris is most passionate about, but I'd like to sort of echo his sentiments in that for those with learning difficulties or not, this has been a very challenging time. We've all faced sort of tremendous upheaval from the initial uncertainty of exams, the delays and adjustments, and obviously the various approaches from different academic years to different academic departments. And a key point I think Chris touched upon, which is resources becoming sort of less accessible as well within the educational stratosphere. So firstly and broadly, I just stress, pat yourselves on the back without being sort of patronizing. Acknowledge what you've achieved and the steps you've taken, even just attending something like an event like this today. But more broadly and more actionably sort of in this area, what I would say is, if you do face learning difficulties or mental health, be it now in the educational sphere or later in employment, I would strongly advocate for having something like a short blurb that you pre-write and that gives some brief sort of overview of your difficulty or the challenge you face, as much as you feel comfortable. But moreover, how you can be supported. And it can be as simple as I suffer with, or I can suffer with, and I can be supported by. And it's really that latter part that's important. And actually that latter part will change relative to the situation. The support you need will likely not always be the same in every environment. But having something like that that's adaptable, and moreover getting used to asking for help when you need it, I think is a really core skill to be developing now. And if you think you're suffering anyway, again, something I think Chris touched upon is do make sure you're getting it recorded by your GP, your tutor, your HR department, because you have to level that playing field. It's very cliche, but pride comes before the fall. So don't deny yourself the access to help, whatever it may be. Because throughout coming to education, you're not doing anything but investing in yourselves. And to do that, you have to understand what you need and self-manage to fulfill your own needs. So to have those tools to ask for help. And very finally on this point, I would say I think again something very cool that Chris mentioned is if we have a learning disability, is to understand it, but not just to understand the challenges and the tools to overcome it, but the benefits. A lot of these neurodiverse conditions have a lot of core skills attributed to them, such as being detailed focused or having great information synthesization abilities and analytical processing or whatever it may be. And I think knowing those skills that you have is really core. And for me, this actually segues really nicely into the second topic we're going to talk about today, which is our careers. As I think being and understanding your position really puts you in the healthiest position to promote yourself from. So talking about careers next, across the board, we have all seen sort of huge get my words out, reconsiderations of operational practices. We've seen furloughs, we've seen redundancies, and we've seen companies really struggling to modify and adapt quickly, especially when it comes to investing in the future and not just maintaining their operations. And I mean, I'd like to say that things are changing, and the companies that can offer things remotely are realizing they have less restrictions on their intake. So it's not all bleak. I would like to stress that as well. But for the students and young professionals in sort of our tender stages of our careers, this does feel like the rug being pulled from under us to a large degree. So obviously, putting aside the end of year celebrations that we've lost insights, there's internships, there's a competitive and depressed job market, and there's far more substantial concerns, which are obviously potential to weigh on mental health. And I mean, frankly, combining these on paper, I think could largely be argued for assuring mental health difficulties, but I would like to challenge that with an argument of resilience. And I truly believe that to be at Cambridge University, to be where we are, to have achieved all we have, that a lot of us have already have those tools there. And it's just harnessing them, building on them, and championing them to the best that we can. And really, it sounds silly, but part of resilience has to be knowing where we can exert energy, knowing what we can spend our time on, and worrying about society going back to how it was, or hoping that the job market's going to change isn't something that we can have any control over. But changing our outlook and our approach to the new job market is something that we do. And for me, COVID to a large degree has flattened the structure. It's a pseudo reset button. Firstly, I mean, there's huge amounts of time and opportunity to reevaluate our past, to investigate our opportunities and our true goals, and moreover, what steps we need to take to achieve them. We have the time to reach out and to network and to learn. I mean, myself, I've lost a summer internship this year and have had to find opportunities to volunteer and undertake projects and to do something to remain active and proactive on my LinkedIn. And if you don't have a LinkedIn, this is a potentially good time to build one. If you do, it's a good time to polish it. And if you can't find a project or you can't find an opportunity, you can make a comment or write a thought-provoking article yourself to keep yourself noticed, to keep yourself active. I'll caveat this with the fact that thinking about the goal, if you want to be a pro golfer, potentially LinkedIn isn't the best route. But if you have corporate ambitions, then yes, exploiting platforms like this is important. Because no matter what COVID has done is it's provided a chance to be active and proactive. And something like Google can be our best friend right now. There are dozens of student recruitment and internship platforms. There are free courses on every subject available, tutoring sites, scholarships, academic competitions, society positions, or just connecting with those where you want to be or those that work with them professionally. Get insight, get advice, and ask for referrals. Because from my experience with early careers, mental health creeps in most when we're stagnant. So although a lot of us wouldn't have actually been consciously aware, of those sort of secondary ancillary benefits of the things we were doing before COVID. But a lot of those experiences that have been lost would have been acting as respites, as a break, as a pressure release, and keeping the momentum. So that's something I'm a huge proponent for, is finding a way now to keep that momentum and champion some sort of methodological pluralism, some dual approach, or multiple approaches to not get sort of fixated down any one path, and create a very objective view as to how to overcome the challenges of COVID. Because what COVID has done is it's provided a really good platform to show and develop our passions, our drives, our ability to overcome adversity and work adaptively and think strategically. And loss is something that happens. It's inevitable part of our lives and our future careers, and therefore this is a developmental experience. And I think, as Chris will tell you, I'm sure from his own experiences, the job market is something that is always challenging. And although we don't see it sometimes, most people don't actually leave with multiple offers. Largely, people send many applications, and the first offer that comes is taken and built from. So there's always likely to be rejections before that success. And I think that's key, is being prepared to handle some of that kickback. And the final point before I harp on too much is, when it comes to, or people that have overcome these difficulties, especially when it comes to anxiety, I think largely will say, measuring success against that of your peers can be a great link to anxiety. And of course, there's nothing wrong with being competitive, but it's also being fair about how you understand and assess your own achievements. And there's always going to be effectively someone bigger and better and stronger. So if we're only looking externally, it's really hard to stop and appreciate what you have. And in that position, it's actually difficult to actually be quite happy and content in yourselves, or ourselves, sorry, and to acknowledge the strengths and positives that we have. So by looking out and not having that contentment, we're not able to sell ourselves in the best way. And I truly believe that it's wanting what you have that puts you in the strongest place to sort of get more of what you want. But before I go on anymore, I'll hand over back to Chris to just add a little bit more on this topic.
Thank you very much, Rickesh. I entirely agree with you, and I'd just like to add to that. I feel that university teaches you to, in a way, accept any failures you make and celebrate your small successes. I feel that in the real world, you learn to, after being at university, you learn to accept these small successes, these small goals that you've achieved. And that's sort of one step to gaining on your successes and to increasing your career as well. And I would like to assure all students that this time last year, I had absolutely no plans at all for what I wanted to do after university. There were two reasons to this. The first was that I felt that during my first and second year, I felt that my results weren't as good as I wanted them to be. And so I felt that in my third year, I had to really buckle down and really work hard. And the second thing was that as I was singing in the choir, and I'm not saying that this applies to any people who sing in choirs or any people who play the organ at Cambridge or anything like that, but I felt from my personal point of view, I really just wanted to concentrate on the choir and my academic degree. But with the choir in particular, it involved a 6-day-a-week service singing and tours during the holidays, singing Christmas and Easter for Christmas Day and Easter Day as well, which were wonderful experiences. I'll never forget them. But I just felt that a job on top of both of these things was probably a little bit too much for me. So basically, I had no plans. And this year I've been thinking about what I really wanted to do. And the pandemic has really helped in that respect. It's helped me think about what I really want to do, what really interests me as well. And I'd say to a lot of graduates who are graduating this year, it's probable that there's not a really good job market at the moment. For example, if you want to tutor, if you want to get some money through tutoring, it's likely that you'll have to wait until September to do that, because at the moment there aren't any school exams going, and obviously a lot of people are receiving online lessons as well from home. So it's probable that by September the tutoring market might have resurfaced, but at the moment it's a bit tricky to get tutoring work, I'd say. Now, the other pieces of advice I would like to give are to never do something that you don't want to do. For example, I'm going to use banking as an example. Now, not all of you may agree with me. Okay, I'm just saying, using this as an example. Say if you were to go into banking, you get a really good salary, lovely house, but you don't actually like banking. Well, in your 30s and 40s, you might have what we call a midlife crisis, in which case you'd think, oh my word, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done something else, something I'm more interested in. Now, okay, yeah, it's probable that if you do something that you're more interested in, you might not pay as well. But if you did something that you didn't like, then that might have mental health consequences. For example, I mean, it could lead to things like no self-fulfillment. It could lead to something like depression as well. So always go for something that you want and that you like, because the probability is that you'll be more successful than having a career that you're not really that interested in. Now, the other thing is, if you don't have anything from September next year, the first bit of advice is to not to panic. And the second thing is to just do something, even if it's sort of going for a walk every day, even if it's going for a run or doing some exercise sort of every 2 days or something like that, just so you can keep a schedule. There's nothing worse than being at home, losing a schedule, and just losing your motivation as well, and everything that you built up during university. And now I will hand over to Rickesh again, and we will talk about family.
Yes, thank you, Chris. That was very insightful. We're moving on to the third and penultimate topic, which is quite a loose one, and I'm going to try to tackle actually quite a few topics within it. So please forgive me if I don't cover everything you would like for any one topic or any one section. But as Nishan mentioned at the beginning, there will be ample time to probe either me or Chris with questions at the end during the Q&A. So talking about family, for me, the word actually has interesting connotations, as it can be so different for so many of us. To talk briefly about my partner over the last 5 years, who has her own irreparable relationship with her parents, and to date finds it difficult meeting new people and avoiding to that prevalent and generic topic of family. And I think this is where it can be so difficult and so different for many of us. Sorry, I think I'm a lot, but something that's such a fundamental, such as taken for granted staple in our lives can be missing or structured differently to that of our own. And when we talk about family, even myself, it's very easy to forget the sensitivities and the variances of what family means to different people. So thinking externally of these differences is something that's also quite a good conscious tool for helping to mitigate mental health. But more internally with our own families, whatever the structure may be, normally and often it can be those that we are closest with that we can be the worst to. And it's that unconditional love that supposedly unconditional that gets tested, as it's the environment where we can let our guard down. It's the home environment where we can show our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities, or our frustration sometimes to these people. And there's a huge likelihood that during the confinement of quarantine, that any of these potential tensions or risk factors have only been exaggerated or extended over these sort of last 12 weeks, 13 weeks of home isolation. And for me, one of the unspoken elements of family relationships is the words pressure and guilt. And aside from obviously all the wonderful, positive love and nurturing that can come, there is the potential I identify with pressure from the expectations, and pressure to fulfill desires for others, to achieve things for others that we fundamentally can't, or don't have the time for, or don't prioritize, especially during sort of our teen and adolescent years and developmental years, when sometimes family can't be prioritized. And sadly, sometimes in the real world, that supposedly unconditional love can be conditional, and can often be very unconventional, or even not forthcoming. So being isolated now during COVID, although can be sort of a very special and sentimental time for bonding, it can also potentially be a trigger for loneliness, a time for tensions and for family flare-ups, so to speak. And houses are in one sense either separated, where support networks are distanced, or confined, and therefore it's critical not just to analyze these factors, but to maintain the appropriate outlets in either finding those quiet spaces and maintaining some sort of space for self-thought within a potentially claustrophobic environment, or making the time to connect and maintain those connections, maintain some form of routine connection and communication. I know actually many students at Cambridge now who are potentially still residing, or who are still residing in Cambridge and haven't gone home, for either being international students, or having limited space in the family home, being mature students, or having families who are very high risk. And the nature of families is obviously evocative of a lot of feeling, a lot of pressure, a lot of tension, it's an emotive topic, let's say, sorry. And I'm going to use this topic to segue into something slightly different, which is international students, because they're just one example of an intersection of things we all face as human beings. So whilst we have our independent family relationships, we have a whole host of other relationships within society, and these are all governed by the brackets that we fall into, however the demarcations that can make us as human beings. So looking at sort of international students as one small example of these demarcations, whilst as a mature student myself, I've seen a lot of the struggles during university, of the challenges of not being able to go home, of being further distanced from the families, and lacking the support that we talked about earlier within the university and educational stratosphere, whilst such an unexpected experience like COVID has happened. And whilst many of us have had to focus internally, there are many out there that are faced with intersections, or are faced with a multitude of positions within their life that have made these struggles far more difficult. And that's kind of the next topic, which is friends. And I don't want to say anything really about this, apart from just asking you to think about the last 3 people that you spoke to. Think about the last 3 friends that you had a connection with, and if you have ever stopped to truly understand and think about all the intersections that they fall into, all of the pressures and all of the different categories that make them as a person, and whether you're considerate or conscious of them when you communicate and when you engage with these people. And I mean, I'm not going to pause here to let you do that, but it's maybe a takeaway that allows you to think about these things, because often with friends, things can often go undiscussed. And I know for myself, it's a very bad habit. And if someone comes to me with a vent about something that's going wrong with them, rather than stopping and sometimes asking, hey, how are you, or how can I help, or what can we do, the first thought process is to throw back my own bigger concern and play top trumps with who's suffering more. So I think there's no value, obviously, in being competitive, and I think it's just very important to sometimes stop and think about the intersections that make us and the intersections that make other people. And the very last topic I'm going to talk about under this sort of broad category is one of those intersections, or one of those groupings that actually we all to some degree fall into, which is finance. Everyone to some degree is restrained or controlled or limited by finance. The spectrum of wealth disparity is no more extreme in any environment really than in a university. And I think Cambridge by far has kind of the most extreme expanse of that disparity. And COVID, as Chris touched upon really briefly earlier, but really rightly earlier, is how COVID has to a large degree impacted things like expenditure for, or not expenditure, but sorry, income for many young students who were in tutoring, for example, as he touched upon, or doing casual bar work or cleaning or ad hoc work within their universities and colleges, and in student bars, being tour operators, research participants, brand ambassadors, and those on sort of commission-based roles those who took overtime, and those in the creative arts. There are so many of these groups that these young students, these young creative individuals, you guys, fall into, and largely talking about these things, from my experience, doesn't often happen until pressures build up, or often we allow pressures to build up and then retreat. And although it's fantastic to talk about mental health struggles, what I'd like to say finally on this point is I think it's very critical to actually talk about the triggers that lead into mental health. So having these conversations about finances, having these conversations about mental health, having these conversations about families, and building that supportive, collegiate sort of network and ecosystem within your friendships groups that will help to mitigate these concerns. So the only takeaway, sort of after my long rant, is to talk, to open up on these topics, and when someone moans, isn't necessarily just to moan back, but to find a way that we can engage and see if we can benefit that person and offer some alleviation to that concern they're facing in their moment. Within the home environment is if we're restrained and claustrophobic, is to find some order. It's cliche again, but a clean house is a tidy house is a tidy mind. And one thing I'm a big proponent for is if you're at home and losing momentum, is one of my favorite tools is to keep a to-do list. No matter how nominal it might be, even if you've lost all motivation, as little as basic hygiene and shower and eat and brush, that crossing something off and that perceiving sense of self-achievement, I think will always snowball. So keep some form of routine and structure in the home environment. Especially if you're feeling claustrophobic, and if it's the other end of the scale and you're isolated, is maintaining that routine of connection. And very finally, I'm so sort of, I know I've gone on, but the last little tidbit I'd give is, whether you're struggling with mental health or not, one thing that I've truly found that is very beneficial for everyone is to begin the day, every day, whether it's during COVID or outside of these environments and wherever society moves to next, but is to start the day with a very brief 30-second mantra, as simple as, I love myself, I'm going to have a good day, it's going to be a positive day because I care about myself. And just a few sentences that make you start the day with a new positive outlook. And on the other side, finish it in a very similar way with spending a minute to think about how the day went, recap it in your mind without any technology on, just peace and quiet for 5 minutes, and think about what happened that day. Think about what could be done differently, and how you could achieve it, so you can let it go and start the next day positive. But end that thought process with not what you can change, obviously think about how you can make things better, but end it with what you did well. End it with congratulating yourself for the good things you did, and hopefully it will maintain a cycle of ending with positivity and beginning with positivity. But I'm sorry I've gone on very long on that point, so I will now pass on to Chris to just conclude on this point of family.
Thanks very much, Rickesh. I'm now going to give you some advice about coping in a family. So you'll have probably realised and encountered by now the difference between living at home and living at university. Obviously, there are probably different rules. For example, if you have a family where you have siblings who are younger, you might have to go to bed at a certain time. You might have to turn your music down after a certain time in the evening. And you might have other rules like what you're allowed to cook as well. But basically, it's quite different, I think, from life at university, where you have that little bit more of freedom. Obviously, some of you may be living in a university house with university accommodation, but I mean, I guess the majority of you will have been living in colleges as well. And by and large, I think no matter what sort of accommodation you live in, you have a little bit of freedom, a little bit more freedom, I think, compared with being at home. So my first piece of advice is to always try and appease your family. I'm not saying do all the chores, because obviously your work is the most important thing when you have exams or during term time. So try and appease them. And that means basically maybe doing the odd chore, maybe asking if you can help with things, but also try and sort of see how people work as well, in order to not try and get on the wrong side of them. Because if you try and get on the wrong side of someone when you're in a family environment and you're trying to work and you've got an exam the next day, that can lead to quarrels and arguments, all of which have a bad impact on mental state and how you think whilst you're revising, or maybe before an exam itself. So that's my advice, really. Now, I'm going to move on to our final topic, which I think is quite important during this pandemic with everything that's been going on, and that is social media. Now, I think social media has a lot of positive things to it. For example, during the pandemic, everyone has had to stay at home. Everyone has had to stay socially distanced, especially when they've had to leave university. You don't see your friends every day. Now, if you have social media, so for example, Facebook or Twitter, that's a really good thing in order to keep in contact with your friends and maybe your family as well. And beyond social media itself, you have Skype, you have Zoom as well, both of which are really helpful if you need any tutorials or supervisions or lectures, or if you just want to have some socials as well. I know that for a fact. I have contributed in some socials recently on Zoom, which have been actually quite nice. It creates a nice environment. However, there are also some negatives of social media, and beyond that, screen time in general. For example, it's been scientifically proven that spending a lot of time in front of a screen can aid depression or anxiety, which aren't very good for, especially if you're working for a degree or if you're doing work. And the other thing is, when people write something on social media, I'm sure all of you will have witnessed nice posts which you like to follow, but also quite sort of quite the opposite. So, for example, if you've seen things to do with the political situations recently, or the general lockdown attitude, the fact that we spent almost 12 weeks now in lockdown, just staying at home, which is a really, it's a really tough thing to do, I think. So always think about why someone might be writing a post. It could be that they're supporting a friend who's in need and they want to show their support. It could be also that they're having a tough time in general. Maybe they've been having a difficult day. And another thing to always make sure to do is to always think about what you're writing on social media. Whenever you write your own posts, whenever you contribute to something, maybe take 24 hours to think about it. Don't rush into it, because that might have bad consequences. I mean, anything on a computer, yes, okay, there's always a delete button, but someone can always save it. Someone can always take a screenshot. I mean, even if it is deleted, there might be a way of getting a post back. And when it comes to job hunting and university applications, a lot of institutions, a lot of companies will look at your social media. So make sure you have privacy settings switched on. And also make sure, though, that you keep updating your privacy settings, because it could be that when Facebook, for example, does an update, your privacy settings are put back to default, put back to normal. So always bear that in mind. Always be professional. Now, concerning mental health itself, I try and advise you to maybe not look at social media before bed or immediately at the start of the day, because that can alter your perspective of the whole day, and it can also alter your sleep. And sleep is very important in terms of mental health. It can alter your perception of things, especially if you don't get enough. I'm sure that many of you during your term at Cambridge will have realised that. And the other thing is, if you don't like someone's post, if you think it is quite abusive or insulting or an opinion that you don't like, maybe just take a break. Take a break from social media. Just unfollow posts as well. That's always a possibility. But these things can have many positives during the lockdown. You can stay in contact with people, as I've said, but also many negatives, which you should always be wary of. And if you understand the negatives, then I think you can learn to appreciate social media and the enjoyment of it as well. And I think that's everything that I have to say on social media. Rickesh, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I know we've taken a little bit longer for everyone's time than we thought already today, so I apologise for that. So I'm only going to try and take a very brief few minutes of your time. But Chris touched upon something really important there about how something can very quickly trigger someone's mental health, especially within the confinement and the strain of the experience of COVID. So I'm just going to take a few minutes actually to show quite a stark and vivid example of how something quite brief was able to have quite a significant impact on someone's mental health, and almost could turn their life around from something that was not directed at them, very generic. And this can be, although this was a TV ad that we're going to show, this can be the very similar thing with social media, where we see something that someone puts generically, and the language or the content triggers or evokes a feeling, and it can very often feel personal. And I think that's very important. So early COVID, someone reached out to me who had created a very small group of Facebook people with people of the name Nick and Rick. And he was highlighting an advert campaign that was done by by a major TV station, and the advertising team actually describes the advert as an advert to ask their viewers to be caring human beings and stay at home. I think that word caring human beings is very important. So I think just now we're going to just play that advert. It's only about 20 seconds long, and I hope you'll all see it actually as playful as it was. But it's also hopefully a great example of how something just in jest or it's not considered can be very damaging, particularly in the circumstances of something like COVID. So we'll just play that now before we go and analyze it.
Sorry, can you guys see it?
Can you just say yes in the
Yeah,
chat? You guys can see that. Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
fine. It might be a bit laggy. Yeah, play it, I think.
Yeah, just tell me if the audio works or not for you guys.
Yeah.
This is Rickesh. Thinks he's indestructible, not afraid of going outside to socialise, asking his mates for a kickabout. What a Rick. He wants to come round with a few cans and hang out, not one of the infections, his mates, or his dad. And his personal hygiene was never that great. He's a Rickesh, but you don't have to be. Stay in, watch telly, don't be a Rick.
Now, I mean, it was a bit laggy. I hope you get some of the idea of the advert. And I want to caveat this with, I in no way see ITV and they are not a malicious operator. But the advert went through a creative team who went through deep consideration, and it was specifically targeting young males under 35. And even a team of professionals can make mistakes, and this is the point. If we go and actually analyze that and some of the concerns with something like that was broadcast, targeting sort of young males under 35 are statistically those that are the likeliest to flout restrictions, yes. But the advert was supposed to be asking people to be kind human beings and with well-intended humor. Yet with isolation comes far more concerns. Human interactions have ceased, and majority of engagements are coming through screens, which can very much blur the lines of what is personal to you and what isn't. And stereotypically, the men that these were campaigning or targeting, young men under 35, are the largest proportion of people who are victims of suicide, are those who are most likely to engage in things like lad culture, so would adopt this sort of rhetoric and undertake bullying. We know from the earlier statistics that these young males and mental health illnesses is 75% of it is triggered before the ages of 24, which is the largest proportion of those that this advert was targeting. That 25% of people in society, and therefore 25% of people named Nick or Rick, are likely to be triggered by some form of mental health concern this year, if not being exacerbated already by isolation. And I mean, that's a key point. I mean, the environment. I recall doing a last anecdote, I promise you, but I recall doing a meditation course many years back, and it was a 10-day silent meditation. And for 10 days, you don't talk to anyone. And even in that experience, at that limited time, the silence evoked so much thought, so many insecurities, so many concerns. And there's many sort of psychological studies on things like this in prisoners who are locked in sort of confinement and things, about the psychological trauma that can have. So at least for one person who saw this advert, they felt so triggered and directly attacked that they were saying they can't be themselves, they shouldn't be who they are, that they should feel vilified and hated within society. And I think although we can't change everything about how we do, or how we operate, taking just 30 seconds or 1 minute before we engage in something like social media and before we post something to think not about how it will be adopted and seen by the masses, but thinking about those small groups, like we talked about earlier, the intersections, and think about the people that are in those intersections and the people that will be most impacted by what is being produced. And that's something that in this advert they fail to see, and we're not there to vilify. A good email was eventually having that taken down and an apology made, and there was nothing malicious there. And I think this is what happens a lot of times: people post things without bad intent, but without having that thought or caveating exactly what they mean, it can be misconstrued. And I think it's those small areas where it can be misconstrued, where it can be most damaging. And it's not just taken lightly, but it seems like a personal attack and impact someone to the point of almost self-destruct. So I think having those conscious thoughts before we post is very important. But I really have taken up far too much of your time today, so I will leave it there and pass back to Nish just to say thank you to everyone.
Yeah, sorry for running over, guys, but I think it was really useful to stress all the points and insights that Chris and Rickesh have given. So I really want to thank Chris and Rickesh for their time today. It's been really insightful. So yeah, at this point, just before we start Q&A, I want to say thanks for everyone attending. If anyone wants to leave at this point, feel free to do so. But just before you leave, I want to share something that we have put together, which kind of summarizes today and provides some good, useful resources. So yeah, we've made a little leaflet which kind of summarizes the key takeaways of this workshop, and it also provides quite a lot of useful links and resources for various areas within mental health, so that everyone's aware of it and has access to resources if they need to. So yeah, we will be sharing this around, so keep an eye on that, and when you receive it, feel free to share it with anyone you know, any family, friends. But yeah, so I think for anyone who wants to leave, they can do so now, but we're going to be starting the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please drop them into the chat or raise your hand and I'll unmute you.
I think there was a question sent to me at the beginning.
Was it my question, Chris? Sorry.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, no. I think my initial question sort of relates to like the family aspect that you guys discussed, which is very key. And
yeah,
I think from my personal experience, I often find it hard to understand how to deal with mental health when it's not directly related to me. So when it comes across, you see a friend that's been struggling, or you think there's something going on, or they're not talking as much as they used to, and things related to that. And I think that's what I wanted to ask you. Have you had personal experiences like that? And what have you guys really done to try and help friends as much as you can? Because oftentimes it's hard to directly address it just because of how they might react, for instance, or for instance, you can't directly go to their parents because they might not like it, something like that. So just your sort of insight on what we could do to help other people around us that we think are struggling.
Yeah. There are various solutions to that, I think. So, for example, I mean, I've noticed that there have been people at times during my school and university time who have stopped talking or feel a little bit down, but they don't want to talk to others about it. And in a way, I think you've got to sort of you've just got to keep in contact with them. I don't think you should be too direct as well. I mean, it really depends on the person. Sometimes you can say, how are you? How are things going? You've been a little sad recently. Do you want to talk about it? Some people are okay about that. Some people aren't as open though. So for them, I'd say, say something like, oh yeah, we're having a party tonight. Do you want to come? Or is there anything, I'm going to the shop, is there anything I can get you? Or something like that. And also just try and make a regular thing of it, not too regular though. So for example, make sure that there's at least sort of twice a week, for example, chatting twice a week and seeing how things are going, but not directly asking, I think. It can be quite a difficult solution to find. Sometimes I think you may need to privately talk to someone, maybe someone with responsibility and professionalism as well, and you say, I've noticed that this person, he's not been himself lately. Do you reckon that something's up? And obviously that shouldn't go anywhere, because the person hopefully that you'll have asked is professional and keeps things confidential as well. And the other thing is to always try and whenever the person who's down has been successful at something, try and praise their successes as well. It's a bit like, for example, if you're a teacher, teaching a student, you praise their successes, and that gives them encouragement and it gives them confidence. In the same way, I feel that if you praise a friend or a colleague, then it should have the same effect on them. Does that answer your question, Amata?
No, I think that's great, and I think oftentimes it's hard to realize that just keeping in touch and just giving some attention, giving them time is probably the best way to go about it. I haven't had too many experiences with it, but from what I know, people have definitely benefited from seeking professional help as well, even though there's almost a stigma or a barrier to break through when you sort of try and approach that. But that's definitely something to consider as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I think the thing to really bear in mind is that if something has gone unseen or undetected, it could get worse, and it could affect, if they're in school, it could affect their exams, their schooling, how they behave towards others, and the same with university, and the same with a career as well. Because the thing is, if something goes undetected and no one knows about it, and people say, oh yeah, he acts quite strangely, that word could get around, and it could affect career prospects. But you've always got to be careful, I think. So always, if you see something, always try and help. And that's why I feel that everyone should try and help someone. If someone is in need, if someone is asking for help, they should always try and help in any way they can. They shouldn't be dismissive or say, well, I think you're getting enough help as it is. They should always try and help them out. And the other thing is, if you're religious, it's the same thing with religion as well. So if you're a Christian, love one another as you love yourself. So it's very important, I think, morally as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
I think Dhruv has a question, so yeah, go on, ask away. Trying to unmute you. Can you unmute yourself?
Is that working now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my question was basically like, for people who are kind of like struggling with depression or anything mental health related at this time, I think especially in South Asian households, there's quite a stigma around kind of these kind of topics, especially like with your parents, because they might not be as aware of these things, having like grown up in India and not having kind of being exposed to kind of like the discourse and the dialogue that we're exposed to in like modern day like higher education settings. So how would you what advice would you give to people who are kind of struggling to bring these issues up within their household and kind of feel like it's not really a safe space to be open about these things and discuss these things?
Dhruv, if I can take that, actually, I think that's a very good question, actually. Thank you very much for that, and very poignant and pertinent to the society we're speaking for today. And this actually touches a little bit on what we were mentioning earlier about that area of intersectionality. And I touched briefly on international students and South Asian students are certainly, obviously, one category within that. I know personally myself, with we were talking about a minute ago, is having those conversations and not having them necessarily in the moments when there's anything that's been flared or something's just happened, but allowing things to settle and approaching parents with concerns, with what you have to achieve, what your anxieties might be, bringing to them actually what your desires and goals are for yourself, and analyzing how they align to your desires, views, and goals of that of your parents. Often Asian families have very specific goals and expectations of young individuals. And the world as we see today, actually, COVID is a very good experience to see how the world has changed, how things are so different, how we have to adapt very quickly. And a lot of the things that were previously important aren't. So there are ways to hopefully show our families that we can still be successful individuals, still maintain the values of an Asian community and an Asian household, but without necessarily following the paths that they directed for us. So I think communication is really key. But the second one, and I think Chris touched upon this earlier, is parents are just humans. Parents are adults who have just grown up with their own idiosyncrasies, their own foibles, their own value systems, their own way of seeing the world. They are not perfect, and unfortunately, especially when it comes to conflict within families or things like this, I find, at least for myself, when I argue, I expect to argue from a logical point of view. No one's logical. Everyone has their own idiosyncrasies, their own perspectives, their own things that are, as we said about conditional love. So to some families, there are things that make love sort of conditional, let's say. So understanding your families and taking that time to say, I actually truly understand what you are as a human being, what your values are, what your expectations are. And by taking the time to actually understand our parents and our families, maybe we can understand how we can meet those expectations, or how we can talk to them about when we don't meet those expectations, but still are fulfilling our goals and hopefully eventually satisfying their desires and wants for us. Because I think deep down, it comes from a place of wanting the best for us. And if we approach it from that perspective and talk to them from that perspective and understand them from that perspective, hopefully some of this can be mitigated. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yep, thank you.
Any other questions? Yep, Sanjan.
Hi.
Yep, go on.
Okay. How do you know if a certain post on social media about mental health is like right or not so right? So all the advice that you see online, they all seem sensible. They all seem to make sense. And is there anything to be wary of when you read advice online?
So I think with any advice online, you should always have a look at who's written it. You should probably research who the person was who wrote it, who they work for as well, and do they have a professional qualification. I think one thing to always note is that anyone can give advice, but it might be that some advice is better than other advice. But I would always stick with people online who have professional experience with mental health as well. And I think that goes the same for us both too, Rickesh and I. For example, we're students with our own stories and our own encounters. And I'd say that we're not professionals, but we're just people who want to tell other people our stories and our opinions as well, and want to help others as well. So always look at the person who's written the advice. Maybe look at the comments as well, any reviews, and the company or institution that they work for, or the medical practice. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
I mean, just to add to that, I would also say the intent. I mean, a lot of people put things on there, and as Chris mentioned earlier, some people put things when they're venting and they're angry, or some people put things because they're politically driven by something that they've seen. And sometimes I think we see something and our political view is slightly different, but the person that's making a statement necessarily isn't coming from a malicious point. They could just be coming from their own point of wanting something better and fighting for it. So I think intent is a very important thing. And And if you can see that someone's intent is positive, then there's an opportunity often to get into a dialogue and talk about the language or the meaning behind what's been said, to understand perspectives. Because the one thing I find with social media, just to add to this, is from my understanding with the algorithms and things that drive it, not that I have any idea, humanities, not academic or STEM or anything like that. But if you're interested in like one viewpoint, like the political left or the political right, it shows you disproportionately those views. And I think that's a problem. So being willing to have conversations with people where views don't necessarily make sense to you, or you think that someone might be being controversial, reaching out and having those conversations, having that dialogue, I think it can be quite helpful if the intent of someone isn't necessarily malicious, but it's just maybe politically driven or driven or written from a point of opinion rather than sort of fact. But I won't talk off too much anymore. Sorry.
Great, thanks.
Right, I think we'll take one more question. Martin, you had another one?
Sorry, I think you just muted. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah, no, I had another thing kind of related to my first question, but a bit more focused on like the current environment. I think obviously a lot of people will have received some bad news during this time, which is horrible and difficult to deal with. And I just wanted to ask what you guys, or just your personal experiences, if you've had any, hopefully not, but how you would deal with situations like this. So, for instance, if you found out that your friends' grandparents, they received some bad news about their grandparents, or they were hospitalized or something, how would you try and approach them? Because that's something I found quite difficult during this time. You almost go blank. You almost don't know what to say to them. So yeah, and any personal experience. I know there's no one right way to go about it, but yeah.
I mean, I think that's the key point. I'll just talk for 1 second because I know Chris has more experience on this probably.
Well,
but as you said, there is no right way to approach it. Everyone deals with loss differently. And I think this is one of the key things with mental health, and the fact that right now we've lost a lot of the outlets. We have time now to understand what works for us as individuals. What are the things that give us catharsis? Because for all of us it's different. Some people it will be running for 3 hours, some people it will be banging a drum, some people it'll be everything to everyone. I mean, for me, I like to do random things, and I'll do something arty. I'll go and carve into a tree, or I'll go and splash paint everywhere. I'll lose my focus into something else. But I think loss, and especially something like this, is inevitable, and we'll need to have the conversations to overcome them. We'll need to connect with our families during that time, but especially during something like COVID, it can be claustrophobic, it can be difficult, and only worrying about or only thinking about the loss can be damaging in itself. So acknowledge the loss, somehow come to terms as much as possible through being with family, being connected, but give yourself that time for catharsis. Give yourself an outlet that will take you outside of just a loss, because eventually that's what you're going to have to do. We're going to have to move on from loss, and it's giving yourself little bits of those breaks from the loss that eventually help you build up those breaks to the point that the loss has become something that's now managed and to some degree overcome. But I'll pass back over to Chris. Sorry.
I think loss is a very important topic actually to speak about at this time, and I appreciate that it's also quite a sensitive topic. Some of you may have lost friends or relatives in the past few weeks, maybe recently as well. I think everyone deals with loss in a very different way. I mean, mourning can go on for months and months, maybe even years, and I think it also depends on who it was, who you've lost as well, a friend, a relative, a best friend as well, how close you were. And I mean, for example, if I had lost someone, I'd probably be doing nothing in particular at the moment. I'd probably be trying to relax myself, just think about things a little bit, go for a walk as well. That would be my way in dealing with loss immediately in the short term. The other thing is, and before it gets to that point, I would say I think the thing that makes it more difficult at this time is that you can't, if you know that someone might pass away during these during this pandemic, then I think it's hard because you can't exactly go and visit them, especially when they're in a care home or a hospital. Obviously, the government regulations mean that no one can visit at the moment. No one can have their relatives or friends at their bedside, no matter whether it's coronavirus or cancer or something else. And I think it's communication is very important. So, I mean, it could be on, as we've said, on Skype or Zoom, but it also could be in the more traditional fashion. You could phone someone, you could write a letter as well. If you're religious, you could also pray for them. And that leads back to one has passed away. I know some people actually who did pass away about a week ago. One person in particular, and what friends did who couldn't actually see them off, who couldn't attend the funeral because they were only allowed 8 people. What these people did who couldn't go was that they went outside into the street and sort of just basically said farewell as the hearse was passing. Now, obviously, that's not always possible because you could be living in a completely different area. I mean, the good news is that hopefully the lockdown restrictions will be lifting gradually in the next few weeks and things may change. So that's some good news, I think. But I think in particular, the past 11 weeks have been very, very difficult in that respect. And I think the other thing which has been quite difficult is the fact that as no one has been let into hospitals and care homes in order to visit, that means clergy can't always people their last rites. In a hospital, for example, you may have 2 clergy in residence, but obviously in a hospital, people are dying every day and they need to be in various wards. And sometimes it's just impossible to get someone to someone's bedside, to get a member of the clergy to someone's bedside. So, I mean, if you're religious, do pray. Also, maybe even contact a member of the clergy as well. Always talk to hospital staff if you can, or care home staff. They might be quite busy at the moment, but just to check how things are going. Yeah, I mean, I hope that helps.
Sorry, I was muted. No, that was very helpful, both Rickesh and Chris. And yeah, I think you're right. I think having some sort of coping mechanisms that you're comfortable with is probably the way to go.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I think that's all we have time for. So I want to really thank Chris and Rickesh once again for their time today and useful insights. I want to thank everyone who came to the talk today as well for finding the time. And as I said before, we'll be sharing out that leaflet, so keep an eye out for that. It provides all the takeaways from today and resources and links. And if you have any other questions that you want to ask Rickesh or Chris personally, I've put their email into the chat as well, so you can access that. But yeah, just once again, thanks everyone and take care.
Thank you for attending. Cheers, guys.